Are your orchids really in their right home? Most people just pot them up because they feel it's easier and safer, but is it really? Could this be the reason that your orchids are struggling? Some orchids like to be free so they can get all that good air movement, they can dry out quickly, and they can breathe. Other orchids like the comfort of a pot where their roots are more protected. The trick is knowing which is going to be best for your orchids and for your lifestyle, because it's not all about what the orchid needs. It's also about your climate, your watering routine, and how much time you have to care for them. In this video, we'll break down the real pros and cons of mounting versus potting. So by the end of the video, you'll understand exactly which setup is going to be best for your orchids in your environment with the care that you can give them. And if you're wondering about the black rings under my eyes, don't worry, it's just nature trying to bring about my demise. This time of year with all the pollens, but that's another story. Let's get straight into that question everyone asks: should I be mounting my orchids as opposed to potting them? This is a little bit like asking, how long is a piece of string? Without a little bit more information, it's almost impossible to tell. So let's divide it into categories so that we can work through the categories so you know what information you're looking for to be able to make that decision for yourself. The categories are the climate, or rather the environment that you're going to be growing your orchids in. How much time that you're going to have to care for your orchids, and of course, the type of orchid it is. All of these are going to play big roles in whether you can pot your orchid or whether you should be mounting it. When looking at the environment that they're in, we're looking at the light, we're looking at the watering that they're getting, we're looking at the humidity, we're looking at the temperatures, and we're looking at how much airflow they have. These are all going to play major factors in potting or mounting. Remember, they all work together, so you can't just look at one and make a decision on that. You have to look at the combination of them all together. So let's look at a few examples to help you understand. For instance, if you have hot weather, perhaps dry air with fair amount of air movement and very little rain, this is probably not a good idea for mounting an orchid unless you are able to water it incredibly frequently. But generally, it's probably best in that sort of climate to put your orchid into a pot, because that way you can hold moisture in and around the roots for longer and help reduce the desiccation of your plant, because also you're going to be providing humidity as that water evaporates from the plant around the plant to help minimize the effects of that hot, dry air on it. So it's going to be very difficult to maintain your mounted orchid in a situation such as that. But then again, if we still keep those hot temperatures, but we add high humidities in and perhaps a lot of rain, then we start getting other problems that we've got to look at. Because if we're getting a lot of moisture in our pot, even if the temperatures are high, we can land up with water buildup in the pot or moisture buildup and the pot not drying out quickly enough. Depending on the media, then again, if you've got a inorganic media, your pot will dry out a lot faster, especially because you've got that heat to cause that evaporation. But then you're starting to mimic the conditions of mounting. So perhaps mounting is a good idea in an area like that. Just remember, with those high temperatures and mounting, even though you do have high humidities, you're still going to have to water frequently. And then if we're looking at the opposite, if we're looking at cool conditions, if you're looking at cool, dry conditions, then again, your pot is going to be your best friend. It's going to help maintain the moisture around the roots of that orchid for longer. But remember, it's going to keep your orchid on the cooler side. And then the moisture being evaporated from your pot, along with perhaps a humidifier, is going to help produce a humidity dome. And those humidity domes do tend to keep warmer air near your plant, and as you go further away, the air is going to be slightly cooler again, but it helps maintain a marginally higher temperature around your plant. And now cool and damp. This can be very problematic, especially for potted plants, because as we had said, as the evaporation happens from the pot, it helps a cooling effect on the plant. So now you're getting even more cooler conditions around your plant. And your humidity is already high. You're adding more moisture to the environment around it. And then what happens? Fungal and bacterial attacks are going to be very common and difficult to control in cool, damp conditions. So not only are you reducing the temperatures, but you're bringing in the possibility of disease. So if you've got cooler conditions, mounting your orchid is going to be better, because the slower evaporation rate is also going to keep moisture in your pot for longer, and that then too is going to cause problems for your roots by producing an environment that's too wet for them all the time. Remember, your orchid's roots like to dry out after watering, or at least have air movement around them and not be soggy all the time. So we can see the climate or the environment that they're in plays a big role in whether an orchid should be potted or whether it should be mounted. But then again, with any of those conditions, depending on how much time you have to care for your orchid, you can keep your mounted orchid alive in those hot, dry areas if you've got enough time to sit there with a spray bottle all day and keep it moist. But most people generally only have a few hours a week to actually look after their plants properly, and that's really not going to be enough time, especially in a hot, dry environment, or even in a cold, low humidity environment, to keep these guys happy. So the lower your humidity is, the more water you've got to give them. And if you don't have the time to water frequently, your pot is going to be your best solution, because that pot is going to provide moisture for the plant for much longer periods than what mounting is, because that mounting can dry out within a couple of hours, and your plant is then dry and starting to look for moisture and water again. And if there's no moisture in the air that it can draw out, then it starts drawing it out of the leaves, and your leaves start going leathery, and then your pseudobulbs start wrinkling, and you're back into problems. But in a pot, you've got no worries about that. You can keep an eye on your pot, make sure that as your media starts to dry out, you can water it again. So generally that's between 5 and 7 days in most environments that will take to ensure the right amount of water for your plant. Of course, in those cold, humid environments, you really want to stretch your watering out as far as possible. Remember, your water is not going to evaporate too quickly in that cooler temperatures, especially if you have high humidities around them. But with this, remember, it's all got to do with the media that you're growing it in. As I said, if it's mounted, and if you're trying to mimic that mounting using lava rock or something, then of course your watering is going to have to be more frequent again. And I'm going around in circles with you, aren't I? So it just goes to show you how everything is interrelated and all sort of knits in together. Okay, where were we? Let's not get confused. Pot, water, care, and also with the amount of time and effort that you want to use to look after your plant, when it comes to feeding, you'll probably have to feed your mounted orchid more regularly than what you will have to do with a potted orchid. The potted orchid, remember, that media is going to hold some of that food and those nutrients for longer, and often you'll need to flush out some of those extra salts once a month or so. Just goes to show what's going to happen there in those pots. Whereas with your mounted orchid, remember, you watering it way more frequently, so you are going to have to feed it too. So you're going to have to feed it more regularly, because your nutrients are going to be flushed away by those other waterings that you're going to be doing. And talking about waterings and indoors, mounted orchids are going to be difficult to keep indoors because you're going to be spraying them all the time, and you don't want to be spraying your walls and your furniture and everything. So unless you have something that you can dunk them in, let them drip dry and then bring them back, it gets a bit difficult, and your time, your effort in that doesn't really pay off, especially if you're having to do it twice a day. So something to think about. Growing indoors, often pots really are the easiest. Now that you're saving your time on watering and possibly on feeding with your potted orchids, you're now going to have to spend more time actually treating them for disease, because they are actually more likely to get disease than your mounted orchids, because of all that extra moisture and stuff that's around. It's going to, in a way, help breed things like your fungus and bacteria that can then be problematic. And with all that good air movement that's around these mounted orchids, you're much less likely to have these problems. And with our mounted orchids, we often find they're far less likely to get things like aphids and even scale. I think it's got to do with the amount of air movement that they're getting. They're more difficult to find, perhaps. Also, it's not so easy for the ants to get to them. So that's one bonus about the mounting orchids, if you can manage them in your home or your environment. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room, the type of orchid that it is. If you are anywhere that's not the hottest tropical environment, that's got so much humidity, you walk out and you start sweating, things like Phalaenopsis probably aren't going to do well mounted for you, because they really like to keep on that little bit of the moist side all the time. So their roots don't want to stay dried out for terribly long, because they have no pseudobulbs whatsoever that hold moisture for them. So if you are mounting them, make sure you've got super high humidity. You want humidity of around 80% around them most of the time. And make sure your temperatures are quite warm, because if they get cold breezes through them, especially being mounted, it's going to cause problems for them. And then we'll move straight to the opposite end of the scale. Things like your Cattleya. These guys actually way prefer being mounted. They like their roots to get wet, and then they like those roots to dry out quite quickly afterwards. They are terribly susceptible to root rot and black rot from the media if your media is not open enough and you're not getting enough air movement around them. So you're more likely to get better success out of Cattleyas when they are mounted than when they are actually potted. You may even find your mounted Cattleya will produce more offsets, more side shoots than what a potted Cattleya will do, because sometimes in a pot, with the lack of light or air movement around your rhizome, you may find not all of those lateral buds are then initiated, perhaps only one. Whereas if it's mounted, the lateral buds on either side of that pseudobulb can both be initiated, and then you land up with a larger, fuller plant quite a bit quicker. And then, of course, plants like Encyclia also do particularly well mounted. But remember, they do like to be kept moist most of the time. So you do want to be spraying them fairly regularly, because we don't want those pseudobulbs to wrinkle. The same with your Coleogeny. With Coleogeny, I don't tend to like to mount them, because I do find they dry out too quickly. Even during that winter period where a lot of other plants can go almost dormant, they still like to have a little bit of moisture around their roots and not to dry out completely. Because if you start getting wrinkled pseudobulbs, then you stop getting these flowers. And they really do like to have a little bit of moisture around them all the time. And that is one of the reasons that often with my cotyledons, I'll put them in an intermediate between mounting and potting and put them in these hanging baskets. For one, not only that way, we can get that long fluorescence hanging down all the way, but it can allow for all that air movement through the whole media to keep those roots nice and healthy. And then again, things like your brassica. This is Brassica brachiata, just coming into bloom now. We've got 3 little spikes here. These guys I put into these plastic pots. I like to keep their roots moist all the time. Sometimes I find I don't water frequently enough for them if I put them into these hanging baskets without perhaps adding sphagnum moss or something in. So if I'm planting in a plastic pot, I can use an open media like bark and bark alone, perhaps with a little bit of charcoal, and then these guys do extremely well. So they also like to grow all year round and like to be moist right the way through. Again, don't make them over wet because that's when we start getting problems. And before I move on from cattleyas again, also the type of cattleya can also make the difference between whether you're choosing to mount and whether you're choosing to pot. Because a cattleya that's going to grow to this sort of size can be really difficult to manage on a mount as opposed to in a pot. In a pot, we can put some stones in the bottom to make it bottom heavy so it's not going to fall over, and then it can stand and grow upwards and produce all those beautiful blooms that we're looking for. Growing on a mount, generally you don't get the same sort of form out of these guys. So you've got to be careful about not only what type of orchid it is, but how it grows. And also we get to our bulbophyllums. These tiny little guys here with their fine, fine little roots actually generally do better mounted. That's the way they generally will grow their best. But when your humidity levels like ours get too low, especially during our winter period, it can dry these guys out quickly. We can see their pseudobulbs are quite small. Although they are quite hardy plants, they can get dehydrated and wrinkled relatively quickly. And since we moved from the other site to home, which is only, really a couple of 100 meters as the bird flies, our humidity levels are completely different. Here we north facing as opposed to there where we were south facing. We were down in the valley there with the river running through the bottom, so we had high humidity all the time. Here we're on the top of the hill, looking straight through, far away from big water sources, and lots of air movement here that pushes all that humid air away. So these guys start to struggle. So with them, again, I use a hybrid method of potting and mounting and put them onto mounts like this, where I've got a lot of sphagnum moss in the middle. This guy's just recovering from being almost dead and completely dried out. So this just goes to show how much all of these things work in with each other so that you can get your orchids to thrive and not just survive. And if you're wondering what sort of orchid you have and what sort of climatic needs that specific orchid has, check that Buy Me a Coffee link in the description box below. Ed has posted up a lot of different videos on a lot of different orchids with their culture sheets. So that should be your go-to resource for any questions that you have. And the last consideration you have to take is how big your orchid is going to grow. We've shown you our large dendrobiums in pots, but you may notice that a lot of our other dendrobiums are mounted on trees outside. And we don't have any of those dendrobiums mounted on mounts like this at all. We leave them out on the trees because, for one, the size that they grow to is going to be way too big to be able to manage just on a mount. And the amount of care that they're going to need out in the trees as opposed to on mounts. These are going to be high maintenance plants if I put these dendrobiums indoors on a mount or in a greenhouse, whereas out in the trees, they can look after themselves. And trying to manage a large plant in a pot is going to be much easier than managing a huge big mount. To be able to get your arms or hands in to move it around is going to be difficult. So remember to take all these factors into account when you're deciding whether to mount or to pot. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and that notification bell. Bing bong! Bing bong! To be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.